we know what it takes to acquire a different language. So clearly we have evidence that it works. We know that this is not the most effective way to actually learn how to communicate.
Dr. Angelika Kraemer is the director of the Language Resource Centre at Cornell University. She was also previously the Executive Associate Director for the Centre for Language Teaching Advancement at Michigan State University. Dr. Kraemer has carried out research into numerous aspects of language learning, including how it is that we learn languages and the role of technology for the modern language learner. I asked her what the research says on how we can learn a new language, how technology can make that easier for us, and the surprising role that culture has to play in learning a new language. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. So, Angelika, how is it, as far as we know, that adults can learn a second language?
Well, Matt, this is such an interesting question. And I think the previous guests that you've had on here have done a tremendous and excellent job explaining that already. I think the biggest difference between adults learning additional languages and children learning languages is that we come with a specific framework already. Most of us have mastered, that might be pushing it a little, but most of us are certainly proficient in our first language, or if you grow up in a multilingual household, multiple languages. So we have gone through the entire process once or multiple times. We know what it takes to acquire a different language, and it is really not about the specific rules and the specific individual pieces for adult learners. It is about, well, first of all, the motivations of why somebody would want to learn another language. But really, having the ability to communicate is probably the most common reason why somebody in a later stage in life would want to learn an additional language. So we certainly can draw on a lot of the research that we know from first language acquisition when we look at adult language acquisition. But I think the fact that we have experiences with communication, experiences with people from many different backgrounds, from many different cultures, I think that fundamentally is very different in adult language acquisition compared to what children will be doing. So as I was thinking about this conversation that I was going to have with you, I actually Googled how many people in the world are multilingual. Now, full disclosure, I did not completely fact check this. So if the internet is lying, that wouldn't be the first time. But I found current estimates that predict that around 43% of people in the world are bilingual, and an additional 17% are multilingual, so more than two languages. So certainly many of these people may have acquired these languages when they were young, but certainly many of these people have acquired languages throughout adulthood as well. So clearly we have evidence that it works. I'm evidence that it works, right? I learned English as well. At what point are you an adult? I'm not sure I am an adult. I want to remain youthful, right? But we all know many people who are proficient in more than one language. And the question is also, how do you define multilingualism? I think there is one of the common misconceptions is that this native speaker ideal is what we all should strive toward. In the context of the United States, at least, we are trying to move away from these evaluative terms. We no longer call other languages foreign language because of the negative connotation that comes along with that. Similarly, we also try to refer to speakers of other languages precisely as that, right? You are not necessarily a one. Hi, puppy.
Well, you guys have some good point. That's it. Oh, sorry about that.
No worries.
He's in bed now. He should be fine. Anyway. Well, so something that made me think from what you were saying there is, how different is that process for adults then as compared to children? Obviously, you're saying that we've got evidence that people can learn languages as an adult, but in reality, obviously, we've got the communication difference, motivation, but is the process any different as far as how we understand second language acquisition?
Well, absolutely. And part of it is because your brain is functioning very differently as an adult, right? As a child, you are learning many different things, language being just one of them. So the fact that we have specific frameworks, specific knowledge in different areas already as adults is makes language learning a slightly different process. As a child, you start with a blank slate. You don't have any preconceived notions of what is what, and you go through different stages, right? You start babbling and you pick up
Mm-hmm.
basically by osmosis, right? This immersive environment, you get input on a regular basis. One of your previous guests mentioned how patient speakers are with young children when they learn, right? Parents,
Yeah.
caregivers, siblings, they're always repeating and slowing down their speech and maybe using gestures or using other visual devices.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes, as an adult, you may not have such sympathetic interlocutor, unless they're a teacher, of course.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there are certainly differences between the processes and the way you might approach language learning. But fundamentally, there are I would say there are more differences than there are more similarities than
Yeah.
differences when it comes to how languages are acquired.
And then, so the classic thing that whenever I hear people talk about sort of this process, is it's quite similar for how we acquired our first language, is then I immediately think of learning or trying to learn German in school and not getting far at all. And so, what are your thoughts on how effective that sort of traditional method, which I think is probably the easiest way to describe it, which obviously might not be that accurate, but that traditional way of approaching it with lists of vocabulary and grammar rules and more sort of memorization, how effective is that in terms of what we know about learning second languages?
As a field, language education has certainly changed and moved away from always just drilling vocabulary and doing um, response, listen and repeat, because we know that this is not the most effective way to actually learn how to communicate.
Mm-hmm.
I think a big piece, and I've mentioned this before, I think it's motivations and goals. As an adult learner, why are you learning another language? What is your ultimate goal? Do you simply want to be able to read books and you are not really interested in communicating with people? Well, then your focus needs to be on, expanding your vocabulary and understanding how sentences fit together. If, like probably the majority of people, you are interested in being able to communicate and speak with others, then I think the approach and the methodology should probably be different and less focused on this rote memorization of vocabulary that many of us have seen in our school years and our maybe even university days when we've taken classes. So I don't want to completely dismiss these quote unquote traditional methods because
Mm-hmm.
we know that they can be effective for some learners for certain end goals, but I think in today's day and age where communication is so important, where we do encounter people with different language and cultural backgrounds, I think the approach should be slightly different and really focus more on communication and the goals that you have set out for yourself, for example, too, as a learner of different languages.
What do we know about how useful grammar is in terms of its how it can benefit learners when they're learning a second language?
Of course, if you want to be intelligible and you want to be able to maintain communication, it is important that you are able to put together sentences and actually communicate in complete sentences and not just what word, right? So grammar and the structure of a language does play into that, but communication doesn't come by studying the rules of a language. And I think that's where these traditional methods that you allude to, or how many of us have learned languages in high school, in higher education, I think a lot of those methods, unfortunately, put grammar before communication, and that I think is that what people associate with the traditional approach. And we know that it is input, it is continuously hearing how language is used and how language is applied, and then playing around with that and trying that out and making mistakes. That's really how you can best advance in your own path toward higher proficiency.
Is there any benefit for learners to try and memorize rules of grammar? Obviously, I know we've spoken about how correct they are when they're speaking, but obviously you can communicate while still being grammatically incorrect. But trying to learn the rules of grammar, does that at some point help people speak more accurately, or is there something else going on there?
I don't think you will be able to communicate effectively if you only rely on chunks of language that you have studied and memorized, right? You might be perfect at understanding the exact structure of a language, but that does not translate into actually being able to communicate, because communication, I don't know what question you're going to ask me next, right? There might be something that's completely left field, or something else is happening around us where we need to quickly react to something, and trying to retrieve, oh my god, here is this rule and you need this adjective ending, or this is how you put together this particular way to express something in the future tense or in the past tense. Your processing ability, you might not be quick enough to go back into the back of your brain and try to figure out, okay, so what was that rule. So I think in communication and in becoming a more fluent speaker, it is really more about practice and being able to play around with the language, to actually apply it, to use it. And you can't do that if you sit at home and you simply study a grammar book and you learn vocabulary.
What do we know about this sort of point of producing the language? There's a lot of people who suggest that you need to activate vocabulary in some way, and I'd be really interested to know what do we know about that. Do you have to, if you've learned all these words and they're in you in some way, you can understand a lot? Do you have to do something extra to activate the words? Is there another step involved, or is it just as a matter of getting lots of input and then that way you'll naturally be able to produce some of the language, hopefully to a good degree?
Yeah, so I don't think you can remove the different skills necessarily. So listening and
Mm.
speaking, I think, are very closely connected. I think understanding how things work in context and how language is used, and that you will receive from actual interaction, from input, from watching movies, listening to language as it is used on a daily basis, rather than this rote memorization of individual words or individual grammatical structures.
If we were to try and take all of that and put it into some general guide, might be a bit too strong, but some key principles that someone can use in order to help their language learning. What things would you say? Right, these are the things that someone needs to try and apply to the way they look at their language learning, or what they're doing day to day for their learning. Are there any sort of key things that people really need to do?
Well, ideally, find somebody who you can communicate with, right? Having a teacher, having somebody who can answer any questions that you might have about why does it work like this, or um, I think you will never be able to replace the human factor in language acquisition. Language also, there's so much related to expressions, emotions, cultural nuances that are part of different languages. Um, and sure, you can read about those things, but until you experience them, I think
Mm.
you won't ever fully understand, and see what different languages can do, and how languages might be different, and what you can accomplish with different language proficiency.
It sort of makes sense then, given what we've just spoken about, to go on to talk about technology, because I know obviously you've got a lot of probably a few views on that. How is it technology can help us with language learning today? Because obviously it's the process to learn a language now is completely different from how it might have looked 50 years ago or even 20 years ago, thinking about it. So what do we know, and what's your view on technology and its role in language learning?
So I think access to resources is huge. The fact that you can listen to any language, you can listen to songs, you can watch movies, you can access the news, and it's all instantaneous.
Mm-hmm.
That is a tremendous resource for language teachers. I mean, nothing in terms of learning a language and advancing in your proficiency, nothing ever beats the opportunity to not only interact with people who speak that language, but go to a location where that language is spoken. So you are truly immersed and surrounded by it. And I think technology has made that more accessible without the need to actually travel to a different location. And of course, there are countless apps that promise you to um, learn a language in a very short amount of time. We already talked about access to potential communication partners. I know some of your previous guests also very successfully teach languages online. Um, so I think with technology, we have broadened the ability to access speakers of different languages, and really, as
Mm.
I mentioned before, access different resources in support of learning different languages, which is fantastic. Um, so I think technology can make tedious things a little bit more easy. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that can be an advantage if you think about some of these apps. If you are motivated by a gamified approach to language learning, you're trying to compete with your friends, and you're trying to see who can spend more time on an app, and who can score higher points, and who has a 500-day streak and things like that. I do think that is motivating for certain types of people,
Mm-hmm.
for certain types of learners. When I think about my circle of friends, so many of them post about their daily streaks and how long they've been going at learning language X. And it's amazing. It's wonderful that these resources that exist that we haven't had access to in the past.
Just because someone's having a streak and there's encouragement online, that might not necessarily talk to the speak to the effectiveness of a particular app or whatever. I know it's been referred to by Bill Van Patten, when I spoke to him, about as old wine in new bottles, which is the way he likes to describe it. And so what are your thoughts on that, in terms of what we know about second language acquisition, and also what you know from all your work around technology? Is there a negative side to it potentially?
Nothing can ever replace human interaction. And you can mimic some of that online, or you can communicate with somebody at a distance via all these different types of apps. Um, but for language learning, for language acquisition, I think really the be all end all would be to be immersed in a language, in a culture. Is there a darker side to technology? I mean, I do think with AI in particular, um, there is a concern about safety, about ethics.
Mm-hmm.
How is AI informed, right? It is only as good as the resources it draws on. And we know that these chatbots aren't accurate all the time. So fact checking is always important. And I think it can be easy to rely on these new tools and rely on technology and simply assume that everything we receive from the artificial intelligence or from technology is correct. But that's not necessarily how language works. I think language, people, communication is constantly shifting. And I'm sure that AI will keep up with that in the future. I don't think it's quite there yet. So I think you will never be able to. I mean, I sound like a broken record here. You can't replace that human interaction, communicating with people who are daily users of that language. I mean, something that I notice about myself and my first language, which is German. I don't know how language is used currently in Germany, really, right? When I speak with my family, they make fun of my German because my German is stuck. You know, my cultural references are stuck decades ago when I left Germany and I moved to the US. Language continuously changes. Um, and I think that's really where having the ability to speak with people who who are immersed in a language, in a culture, who can help with that. And technology is not quite there yet to completely represent that.
You make obviously those are good points there. But one thing that I just immediately thought about was there's all these options in terms of technology and apps and all sorts of resources, but it also does depend to a degree on the language you're learning, right? Are there some languages that actually, yes, there is technology there, but it's not serving certain types of languages, or less popular languages, if we put it that way.
Well, yeah, one thing that colleagues who teach less commonly taught languages or even least commonly taught languages struggle with is that there aren't that many materials available. For the more commonly taught languages, of course, you can find anything in Spanish, in French, maybe in Mandarin. We see this in my position here. We do get email requests asking, do you happen to have online materials for learning Twi, for example? And people are looking, and I think certain groups, who have that heritage or who are interested in maintaining language communities certainly provide information like that. But generally, a lot of resources and a lot of money is invested in some of the larger languages. So I do think not all languages are created equal. And this is actually something that has come up with some of your previous guests as well. This whole notion of language difficulty. Is one language more difficult to learn than another? And I agree with what your previous guests have said in that regard as well. I do not believe in difficulty as a concept, right? I think Diane described this as different and distant and not difficult. I think the tricky part is that there is simply so much out there now. And how do you
Yeah.
vet what is good and what is effective? Because if you Google, top app for learning a language, I mean, sure, there are algorithms where companies can pay to pop up first. But I think that's something where if you have other friends, if you know a language teacher, ask them for a specific language, what is a reputable app if I want to go that route and start building my vocabulary or building, my base level of language and comprehension and understanding, what can give me that input online. Because there are good things out there and there are bad things out there.
Okay. And so how is it that someone can spot the bad things? Is that possible for someone can go, oh, actually, this looks like something that maybe Angelika wouldn't be that keen on. And so how does someone who hasn't got your experience, how do they know, all right, actually, this is maybe something that perhaps I should steer clear of?
I think, again, if the goal is to communicate, and if a program, an app, or anything online starts out by telling you, well, first of all, making the false promise that you will be fluent after a week, a month or whatever. That just is not realistic. We know that is not how languages are acquired. So I think being mindful of that. Um, and certainly companies want to make sales pitches to convince you to buy their product. But dig a little bit deeper into that and see if they really claim that this is evidence-based and that they have so many people who after just 1 week were able to like survive abroad. So that would give me pause if an app makes such sweeping claims. If the technology focuses exclusively on individual words and you only see words and you have to match them or whatever, and there is never any context, there is never any like connected speech, any sentences or phrases, that would also be maybe not the best way to move toward a path of proficiency.
Something that you've got a lot of experience in, and perhaps drawing more on your personal experience, perhaps professional as well, is the relationship between culture and language learning. Because when I first heard you speak, I just assumed you were American, and not just because you've got a phenomenal accent, but it's actually because you word things in sometimes a way that me as a British English speaker, I wouldn't word it that way, because there are just things that just happen between American English and British English, and that's more of this kind of cultural aspect. So what role do you think culture plays in language learning, and how's that involved?
A huge role, to give you a very short answer. So I think you can describe culture as the lens through which language is shaped and understood. The way that you express empathy and emotion can be very different in different languages. The way you use gestures can be very different. And what is friendly and acceptable in one culture may be very different in another. So I think understanding and learning those nuances is definitely important. And that is something that, again, an app, sure, they might have a certain list of, this is how you use hand gestures, or this is how you greet people, or this is how you express politeness. But as we've said before, language continuously changes and shifts. Understanding humor, right? Sarcasm, those are some things that are among the most difficult to and I don't even want to use the word master, because what's mastery anyway? But to even understand, those things cannot be translated one for one, right? Idiomatic expressions. Those are often very closely aligned to culture and to history in a particular group of people. Ultimately, it's about relationships, right? And you need to be able to recognize and respect things that are different, and be mindful of that as you interact with people, so that you don't have strange, uncomfortable moments, I guess.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately in today's day and age, right, we are a globalized world. So cross-cultural competence is hugely important. Just being respectful toward people who come from a different background, from, a different culture, who have their own set of values. And I think language and culture learning helps open your mind in that regard, and it helps you navigate and contribute to different international settings and different settings where you might be interacting with people from different cultures and different backgrounds.
Yeah, and it just on that is just makes me think there could be situations where actually linguistic ability wouldn't be as important as cultural knowledge,
Oh,
right? And
absolutely. Absolutely.
you
Yep.
could be, C2 level in whatever language you want
Yep.
and offend everybody.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, so interesting. Given all the things we've mentioned, and all your experience in when it comes to how languages are learned, and also what you know about technology. So, if you had to from tomorrow start learning a new language, what would that look like?
Do I have unlimited resources?
No, you're in the real world.
Okay.
so you can move abroad if you want, but then that might involve a lot of logistics at home. So
Correct.
you know, for most people that
Yeah.
involves staying put. So what would it look like for you?
So I would look for somebody who um, obviously knows the language and knows about the culture. I would look for a teacher. It doesn't need to be a native speaker, right? We talked about that before. I think sometimes if you have acquired a language yourself, you are more in tune with the struggles that your own students will face. So there can sometimes be an advantage to finding somebody who speaks multiple languages, and you're learning one of those additional languages from them.
Yeah.
Not being shy to actually communicate and play around with language, because that's how we will ultimately advance in our proficiency. I think the only mistake that you can make is not to try and not to do it.
For anyone who has struggled with trying to learn a second language in the past, which I think is quite a lot of people, certainly that I know, um, how would you? What words of encouragement could you give them to help them on their path so that they do actually finally learn that second language?
I think being patient with yourself and compassionate with yourself is important. I think understanding that language does not develop overnight. I mean, this is very similar to engaging in a sport, right? You do not become an Olympic athlete overnight. It takes a lot of time and dedication and practice. You have to be gracious when things don't work out the way you want them to instantaneously. But persistence is important, sticking with it, um, practicing regularly, right? Listening to the news or music in the background while you're cooking, while you're folding laundry, just getting as much exposure as possible. Um, and also being okay with stepping away from it for a day or two if things get crazy. Reminding yourself of the benefits of what having proficiency in another language can bring you, the connections it can forge with other people. We talked about the importance of culture.
Hmm.
And I think, again, if you think about the people you interact with on a daily basis, how many of them have a different language background? How many of them have a different cultural background? And thinking about what has it what has it taken for those people to get to the point where they are, um, and knowing
Hmm.
that, what did we say, more than half of the world population is multilingual or at least bilingual. You can do it.
Brilliant, brilliant. Well, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for speaking with me. This was fantastic, a lot of fun.